Well, good morning. It's a privilege to be here with you at GBN, this event today, and we're going to have some fun together learning. Do you like to learn?
Yes.
Do you like to have fun learning?
Yes.
All right. Well, one thing you're going to learn about me very quickly is that I speak very rapidly. And I get up to gusts of 200 to 300 words per minute sometime. But God created you with 2 ears and me with 1 mouth. So you can listen twice as fast as I can speak. And I think Singaporeans speak very rapidly as well, so you should have no problem understanding me this morning. How many of you remember Y2K, year 2000? Maybe you are working on getting your systems all up to date and making sure the computers were not going to crash. There was a large leadership event back in Chicago in the United States of America where a pastor by the name of Bill Hybels was interviewing our president, President Clinton at the time, at the height of the Lewinsky scandal. How many of you remember the Lewinsky scandal? Okay, so it was not a very good time for our president. And this large leadership conference had a lot of pastors present. So many of these pastors were very uncomfortable when the president walked in and was interviewed by a pastor on leadership. Now, Bill Hybels started out with a question, and he said to the president, when the American people see you walking to church with a Bible under your arm, they think that you as a president are doing that for political gain. You're trying to win the evangelical vote, but it's only a show. Well, the president said, you know, I've been going to church for 30 years, at least it's been a consistent show. And then Bill Hybels went on and he began to talk about some other more comfortable subjects on leadership. And he said to the president, Mr. Clinton, tell us who impacted you, who inspired you in leadership throughout your life. And Mr. Clinton said, well, a man by the name of Gandhi from India had a tremendous impact on my leadership. And Nelson Mandela from South Africa, I learned a lot from him on leadership. And then he talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement in North America. And he talked about Kennedy from Massachusetts. He talked about all these men who had leadership impact, and then it was time for him to go. The security detail whisked him off the stage. And the next speaker on the podium was a man by the name of Ken Blanchard. Ken Blanchard wrote a book a number of years ago called Lead Like Jesus. How many of you have heard or read the book? Okay, maybe 2 or 3 of you. And Ken Blanchard, who is well known in the business world, wrote a book, The 1 Minute Manager, has written over 50, 60 books by now, went on to talk about leading like Jesus, but before he did that, he asked the crowd of pastors a question. He said, if Mr. Clinton had said, Jesus of Nazareth was one of my leadership role models, do you think the legacy he left as a president would have looked a lot different? And of course everybody clapped and said, yes, now we can pick on our president, because they were very uncomfortable having him there since it was at the height of the Lewinsky scandal. And I ask you, how many of us in leadership have ever looked at Jesus of Nazareth as a leadership role model? I mean, usually Jesus is relegated to the church world. We don't think in terms of Jesus as a leadership role model. He had 12 disciples. One turned out really bad. And really, the organization that he began, called the church, never really kicked off until after he left. So why would we study Jesus on leadership? Let's leave Jesus for the church world, but let's not look at him as a leadership role model. Well, this morning, I would like to introduce Jesus as the greatest leadership role model ever when it comes to serving leadership. That's where we're going to go this morning. Now, if you lived 2,100 years ago and you were a gambler, would you have put your money on this rabbi from Nazareth with 12 incompetent disciples, or would you have put it on the emperor of Rome and his massive armies? Well, here we are 2,100 years later, and we name our children Peter, James, and John, our daughters Mary and Martha, and we name our dogs Nero. So I think it's pretty clear that Jesus' model has been sustained over 2,000 years, whereas the Roman system of power has risen and fallen over time. And as we look at our political states today, we realize that we need some new models of leadership, especially in America today. Please don't follow our election, all right? I think we've become the joke of the world at this present time. So we'll leave politics alone. A little bit about myself, an introduction here. I taught school at one time back in Canada. I'm originally from Canada. My wife, who is here this morning as well at the back, she is from America, so I actually have 2 passports, both Canadian and American. And I not only taught school, but I also directed a nonprofit up here in Thailand for 10 years. And after those 10 years, I moved back to North America. I've been there for the last 8 years. I work in the business world. I recently started a nonprofit called the Reverb Network. We do leadership development around the world. And I talk on a number of issues: communication skills, serving leadership, which we're going to be looking at this morning. Also talk about developing a purpose statement and how to engage your employees. Those are a number of things that I speak about in the business world. I'm here to give you my best shot this morning. We're going to have some fun together learning about leadership, and I hope you have a good time. But I'd like to first take a look at what are we aiming for in our time together. What is our goal? We want to discuss some common struggles you have at work, at home, and in your community in terms of leadership, serving leadership. We want to make some new discoveries as well. We want to figure out the complexity of leadership and go towards simplicity. I always believe that complexity in our world really doesn't have to be as complex as we make it. There is a simplicity on the far side of complexity. Leadership is not as complex as we have made it. So we want to help you refine the direction, the path of your leadership point of view today. And then, of course, we are going to be using Jesus of Nazareth as our leadership role model when it comes to serving. He gave us this image of washing feet as the highest level of servant leadership. Now, most of us today probably don't wash each other's feet, but there are ways that we can serve those that we lead that may be akin to this image of Jesus of Nazareth. All right, let's start with the serving leadership journey in your notes. The serving leadership journey. Where does leadership begin? Does it begin with an organization? Does it begin with leading another person? No, leadership begins with me. Leadership begins with me. In fact, on this circle of the serving leadership journey, we want to start up here at the top with me. I can only lead others when I have effectively led myself. Jesus even models this. Now, I don't know if you've ever read through the book of Hebrews and come across a verse that kind of fried your circuitry. But there's one in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 that has kind of blown my mind. And it goes like this. Son though he was, talking about Jesus, he had to learn obedience by what he suffered. Now, I didn't know that Jesus had to learn anything. He was God. He knew everything, and he was never disobedient. But that scripture said he had to learn something. And I believe that passage is actually reflecting back on the temptations that Jesus suffered in the desert. You might remember Matthew chapter 4, Luke chapter 4. We have three temptations that Jesus suffered. Does anybody know the first one? This is a self-leadership issue right here from the temptations. Anybody want to guess? Turning stones into bread. Have you ever been so hungry? Maybe you've come home from the office, you're walking up your driveway and you're kicking those little pebbles that are on the driveway going, I am so hungry, I wish I could turn them into M&Ms. Has that ever happened to you? That's never happened to me either. So I kind of, just go over that temptation. It doesn't really relate to me. I really can't, take anything from that. But what if there is something much deeper? What if there is a leadership temptation or lesson for us to learn from the temptations of Jesus? In fact, we could say that in that first temptation, Jesus is being tempted to gratify the flesh. And remember, every one of the temptations is prefaced with, if you are the Son of God, then. So it's an identity issue. Every one of us as leaders struggles with our identity. If you are, then do what you say you can do. And so this temptation really is, if you really are the Son of God, and you're hungry, you've been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, then go ahead, turn stones into bread, gratify your flesh, do what you want to do for you right now. And isn't it a fact that in our leadership, many times we do what we want to do for us. We're self-serving leaders. Leadership is all about us. And Jesus teaches us that leadership is not about us. It's about something greater than us. It's not about gratifying my flesh. Take a look at WorldCom. Take a look at Enron, some of the largest corporate scandals in North America a number of years ago. Bernie Eggers, Ken, the other, I can't remember his last name right now, who led these massive corporations, Some of these men were Sunday school teachers, and yet they were self-serving. They raped their companies. They destroyed the retirements of so many people in their companies. They were self-serving leaders. Jesus teaches us that leadership is not about us. He says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So what we learned from Jesus in the first leadership temptation is that it's not about us. It's not about using our leadership to get what we want for us, to use our power for us, but it's to use our power for something greater than us. And you notice all the way through the Gospels, Jesus is always deflecting the praise. Second temptation. Satan takes Jesus to a very high point. And here we are in the middle of Singapore, surrounded by these high buildings. I need to ask you, have you ever been tempted to go to the top of one of these buildings and bungee jump off? Actually, without a bungee cord. Just be a Superman, right? Has anybody ever been tempted to do that? Satan takes Jesus to a high place and says, jump off! And I've never been tempted. That's not a real temptation for me. And so I kind of run over that temptation and say, well, I can't relate to that. Well, what if there's a leadership story in here for us? A leadership lesson. What if, in fact, what Satan is saying to Jesus is be a Superman leader? I mean, what better place than for you to go to the height of the temple and to leap off in front of all the religious elite, all the Pharisees, all the PhDs, all the scribes and the lawyers, and to declare to them, I am Messiah, I have come. Be a Superman leader. Do we see Superman leaders today who say leadership is all about me? Declare yourself, announce yourself. Not so with Jesus. Not so with Jesus. He comes into the world as a little baby. Jesus does not assume. Jesus comes to serve. It's not about me, it's about my Father's will, he says. And when he is ever tempted with applause and success, Jesus sneaks away from it. He goes to the backside of a desert. When he heals Peter's mother-in-law in Mark chapter 1, the next morning he's out having solitude. The disciples are saying, Jesus, where are you? The waiting room is filled. We've launched a massive healing campaign. You need to get back here. And Jesus says, no, we must go on, for this is why I've come to preach the good news. Jesus stays focused on his mission. Leadership is not about him. He's not a Superman Jesus. Our leadership, if we can learn anything from Jesus, is it's about serving a higher cause, a higher mission. Jesus is fixed on gaining his Father's approval. He's not fixed on gaining people's approval. He has a mission and a purpose to fulfill. Self-leadership. Self-leadership, the third temptation. First one is deny instant gratification for something greater than you. The second one, don't be a Superman leader. Don't use your gifts, abilities, and talents for your glory, but use it for a higher purpose. And the third temptation, you might remember Satan taps him on the shoulder and says, bow down and worship me, and I will give you the kingdoms of this world. How many of you have heard voices saying, bow down to me, and I will give you the kingdoms? Anybody? Okay, if you have, we'll try to find a counselor for you, all right? If you're hearing voices. I've never been tempted with that either. And so I kind of run over that and say, well, I can't relate to that, but maybe there's a leadership lesson for us here, folks. What if, in fact, what Satan is offering to Jesus is a shortcut to success? Don't go the long, hard road of the cross. I'll give them to you on a golden platter. The kingdoms of this world, here they are. All you have to do is just bow down for 3 seconds. Here's a contract. Sign your name on the dotted line, and we're good to go. You can have the kingdoms back. And Jesus said, no. I will not sell my soul to the devil to get what I want. I will not justify the means because of the end. I will not sacrifice my soul. I will not fudge. I will not take a shortcut to success. Folks, these are leadership lessons at the self-leadership level. And Jesus, when he led himself well, when he overcame those 3 leadership temptations, the next thing he did is he went out to the beach and he began to call the fishermen to follow him. Here's my question for you. Are you a leader simply because of your title or your position? Or are you a leader because you are somebody worth following? A serving leader is somebody worth following. And when Jesus conquers the 3 big leadership temptations, he becomes a leader worth following. The disciples instantly dropped their nets and followed him, we read. And so we now go to the second part of leadership, which is leading another. Leading another. When you and I become a leader, worth following, we can establish high levels of trust with other people who look to us and say, I want to follow your leadership. You're somebody worth following. You're not so hung up on yourself. You care about me. You truly want to serve the best interests of others. Therefore, I want to follow you. That's leading another. And of course, when we begin to lead another very, very well, what happens? We begin to lead teams. We begin to form those people together into teams. And in Jesus' world, he took a group of, we could say, incompetent people from various backgrounds, right? You have the zealots. They were known as Sicarii. That meant they held these little swords, and they would try to sneak up by a Roman soldier and stab him and then melt away into the crowd. They were called Sicarii zealots. And then you have a guy by the name of Matthew who was a tax collector. In North America, we would call him an IRS agent. Somebody who collaborates with Rome. You've got a collaborator with Rome and you have somebody who hates Rome. Can you imagine the zealots sleeping beside Matthew? Their sleeping bags that close together. Jesus brought these people from very diverse backgrounds and formed them into a team. That's what you do when you lead self and you begin to lead others very well. You can form them into teams. And of course, the ultimate reality is you get to an organization if you lead well. An organization is the automatic result of leading yourself well, leading others well, leading a team, and then finally, leading an organization. The serving leadership journey. I'd like to now move to the next diagram in your notes. How many of you have seen the impact of a very small stone when you throw it out into a pond or a pool of water and a little ripple? And that little ripple influences another ripple, and that one starts another ripple until the entire shoreline of the pool or the pond has been impacted by that tiny little stone. Jesus teaches us in leadership, serving leadership is really around this major concept that I go deep with the few to impact the many. Go deep with the few to impact the many. So I direct this nonprofit network. We're a nonprofit. We work around the world. In fact, I'm headed up to Thailand tomorrow to work with developing leaders. We've been in Uganda, Cameroon, Liberia. We're also going into Nepal and different places where we work with a small group of leaders over a 4-year period. And we go deep with the few, and the goal with each of them is after we've trained them in leadership is that they train others in leadership. In fact, we don't go to the next level unless they are training others. We don't invest in people unless they're training other people in the same thing. And I think this is really what Jesus did when it came to discipleship. In John, I believe it's around chapter 5, there were a number of people that left him. They were disciples. And Jesus looked at the 12 and said, "Are you also going to leave me?" And they said, "No." To where else would we go for life? And so when it comes to leadership development, folks, we can't lead everybody at the same level. But we can lead those who are hungry to be led. And in a sense, to be discipled. To become disciplined self-leaders. And when we begin to focus on the few, that is when we're going to see the impact of the many. So take a look at your diagram here. The first level is leading ourselves. We become a leader worth following. The next level is the inner circle. In number 3 there in your notes. Jesus led himself. Who were the 3? Does anybody want to shout that out? I think I heard Peter, James, and John. Pete, Jim, and John. And Jesus leads this 3 at a higher level. If you look at the scriptures, they're the ones that went up in the Transfiguration Mount. They're the ones that went into the house of Jairus, saw the daughter raised from the dead. They're the ones that went into Gethsemane. Jesus spent most of his time with the 3. And you'll notice when you get to the book of Acts that these 3 went on to lead in higher levels of leadership in the early church. Then you get to the next level, which is the disciples, the 12, we could say. Jesus spent more time with the 12 than anyone else. But we know there weren't just 12 disciples, there were also 70. Jesus sent out the appointed ones in Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 9, he sends out the 12. Luke chapter 10, he sends out the 70. And then, of course, we get to the early believers at Pentecost, the 120 in the upper room. And then after that, of course, you have the 3,000 new converts at Pentecost, the first day. So there's this ripple effect of leadership. In the business world, we talk about the Pareto principle. Some wise man from Italy, I believe, came up with this thing called the 80-20 rule. Spend 80% of your time with 20% of your people who will give you the greatest results. How many of you have heard of the Pareto principle? Yeah, most of us in business, that's a very common term. It didn't begin with an Italian guy named Pareto. Jesus had 3 out of 12. Basically a 25% out of the ratio of disciples. And then, of course, the question mark is you and me. Look at how we have been influenced because Jesus went deep with the few to impact the many. That is the role, that is the principle of leadership that Jesus represents. So leadership is influence. It's influence. It's that simple. Leadership happens when you and I simply take time to influence another person. I love what John Maxwell once said as his favorite leadership proverb. Now, you won't find this in the Bible. He made this one up. But he went King Jimmy on us, or King James. And it goes like this. He who thinketh he leadeth but hath no followers is simply taking a walk. Let me say that again. He who thinketh he leadeth but hath no followers is simply taking a walk. So that's John Maxwell on his leadership proverb that he, I guess, added to the King James version of the Bible. But the reality is, if you and I have nobody following us, we're really not a leader. You might wear a title, you might be a director, you might be a manager, you might be a CEO. But the reality is, my question to you is, do people follow you when you are no longer in the room? This really occurs when I, as a parent, begin to look at my teenagers. Do they only follow me when I'm at home? I have 3, by the way, so you can add me to your prayer list, all right? Do my teenagers follow me when I'm not at home? Do they take on my values? Do the people at my office, at my business, do they follow my value system? Have they taken on the purpose and the commitment of our organization? We are only leaders, true leaders, when we have influence, not when we just simply wear a title or a role. People will only follow us so far with a title or a position. Leadership is influence.
The one that we are using here is someone worth following who accomplishes a higher purpose by developing others. The first big question we have to ask ourselves as leaders is, am I somebody worth following? Am I a leader worth following? That's the question. Am I willing to develop others, to empower them, to release them, even if they outstrip my leadership, outstrip my success? In fact, I would say that we really are not successful as leaders unless we raise up a successor. Take Coca-Cola, for example. Back in the 1990s, the man who ran Coca-Cola was Robert Guazeta. Now, Robert Guazeta was diagnosed with cancer, and within 6 weeks, he passed away. Now, you would think that the Coca-Cola stock would take a major hit because of that, but it didn't. You know why? Because Robert Guazeta had been developing a young man by the name of Doug Iverson. He had sent him off to Europe to run their European division, and Doug Iverson was ready to take over the helm at a minute's notice. Why? Because Robert Guazeta had been developed by a man by the name of Robert Woodruff back in the 70s. He did the very same thing for Iverson that had been done for him by Woodruff back in the 70s. Leadership development. We are not successful unless we raise up a successor, unless we are developing others. Jesus said to the disciples, I don't know if this verse has ever blown your circuits like it's blown mine, greater works you will do when I go back to the Father. Now that's quite a leadership attitude. Most leaders want to build their little kingdom, build their domain, make a name for themselves, and they don't care what happens after they die. Not so with Jesus. He was committed to a purpose, to a mission, something higher than himself. When you and I lead, we lead to a higher level. We serve a greater purpose than ourselves. We raise up successors. We develop people. Winston Churchill captured this definition when he said, we make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give. Let me say that again. Winston Churchill said, we make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give. How many of you have seen this depiction in leadership before? I don't want to change. I want all of you to change. Not exactly the best model of leadership, but this is a problem that we often face in today's leadership here in our world. So I'd like to present to you the idea of serving leadership in 2 terms or 2 different roles. And I have to do this because I think sometimes when we hear the term serving leadership, we think about the inmates running the prison. A serving leader is soft. He just allows people to do whatever they want to do. But that is not the case. When Jesus came into our world, he was very clear on his vision, on his mission, and his purpose, and the traditional pyramid of leadership stood. As leaders, we cast vision and purpose from the top down. As leaders, we take responsibility for the mission. We're very clear on that. Jim Collins, in his book, Good to Great, talks about level 5 leaders. And he says these are people that have this incredibly high level of humility and also this fierce resolve, this professional will, Jim Collins says. Think about Jesus as a man of tremendous humility as a leader. And he also was very focused on accomplishing his Father's will. He had a professional will, a fierce resolve. In one of the passages in the book of Mark, it says that he fixed his gaze on Jerusalem, and the disciples said, let's go up and die with him. Jesus knew what was going to happen to him, but he was resolved. He had a will. This comes from the top down, folks. The traditional leadership pyramid stands. We call this the shepherding role of leadership. If you go to the old country of Israel and you look at the way shepherds lead their sheep, the shepherds are out front. They're taking their sheep from one little place to another little place because the pastures are very sparse there. Not only that, at nighttime, a shepherd will lay his body across the opening of the stone enclosure where the sheep sleep. The shepherd will give his life for the sheep. He is the door to the sheepfold. A leader takes responsibility. When things go wrong, a leader says, that's my fault. I didn't teach and train my people well. A serving leader takes responsibility. We're going to look at this a little bit later from an analogy that Jim Collins gave us about looking in the mirror. Looking in the mirror. We look in the mirror when things don't go well and we take responsibility. But we'll come to that in a little bit. So shepherd leadership. And then, of course, the second part of leadership is what we're calling the stewarding part. In shepherd leadership, what we are doing is serving our people with a vision and a direction, helping them to accomplish the mission. So we cast vision from the top down. But then when we get to the stewarding aspect, we flip the pyramid. And now we are at the bottom serving our people, giving them resources. Whatever they need from us, we serve them, we empower them, we help them to accomplish the mission. Ritz-Carlton is a great example of this. How many of you know the Ritz? I think you have the Ritz here in town, right? Maybe none of us are wealthy enough to stay at the Ritz. I'm not. I don't stay at the Ritz Hotel, but apparently it's an amazing company of hospitality. In fact, they have a 6-week training program that they put their employees through. And at the end of 6 months, or 6 weeks, they give their employees, their new employees, those who say, yes, I agree with our purpose and our mission, which is, we are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. That's the mission of the Ritz-Carlton. We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. At the end of that training period, they give them $2,000 in discretionary money. That means that every frontline employee is empowered to solve any kind of customer service problem with $2,000 without asking their manager. That's a lot of money. The people who clean the rooms are given $2,000 to solve any kind of customer-related problem without asking their manager. And so there's this great story that Ken Blanchard likes to tell about the Ritz back in Atlanta. And there was a CEO of a major corporation who had left the hotel, was on his way to the airport to catch a flight to Honolulu, Hawaii for a major corporate meeting the next day. On his way to the airport, he discovered that he had forgotten his laptop. And on his laptop were all his PowerPoint slides for his presentation the next day. He panicked, he got on his phone, he called back to the Ritz and he said, have housekeeping go to room so-and-so, get my laptop and give it to Federal Express. Now, maybe you have DHL. Is that right? DHL here in Singapore. Give it to DHL, and they need to guarantee overnight delivery to Honolulu so I have it in time for my 1 o'clock speech tomorrow. Well, Howard Schultze, the CEO of, Howard Schultze, the CEO at that time, was walking through the lobby and at the Ritz in Atlanta, and he noticed that Mary from the housekeeping department was gone. Here's a leader who actually knew his frontline employees. He was a serving leader. And he just happened to say, where's Mary today? He noticed that she wasn't at the hotel the next day. And they said, well, she's in Honolulu. Honolulu? What's she doing in Honolulu? Well, there was this gentleman, and by the way, Mary was the housekeeper. She was the one that cleaned the rooms. She was the one that got the laptop. She flew to Honolulu with the laptop. She didn't trust Federal Express to get the job done. She was afraid he wouldn't get his computer on time, so she hand-delivered the laptop, took her $2,000, and spent the money. Now, you would say, that was not a wise decision. She should have trusted Federal Express. Let me ask you something. Did they make any money on that transaction with that businessman? Did they make any money? Not in the transaction, but boy, did they ever have a lot of great free marketing. Ken Blanchard heard about this story. I tell this story. People heard about the Ritz and said, wow, now that's customer service. And of course, everybody wants to go to a hotel like that. Serving leadership empowers your frontline employees. At your company, at your business, what do your employees need from you? Are they empowered? Have you shepherded them well and now steward the resources to them? You are a steward of the people that you have and the resources. And so, in serving leadership, we flip the pyramid upside down and we support. We become partners with our employees. We partner with them for success in fulfilling the mission of our organization or our business. We are partners with them. We're not above them. We are below, supporting, empowering, and serving them. That's servant leadership. That is servant leadership. I'd like to now introduce to you the domains of leadership that we look at. An organization that I also do a lot of training for. I was with the Girls Brigade the last 2 days teaching Lead Like Jesus. It's a nonprofit organization that works with developing leaders in the role of leading like Jesus. And they talk about the hands, the head, and the heart of leadership. And of course, the habits, which we're going to call disciplines. At the heart level, this is where we all need to begin as leaders. What are our motivations for leading? Why do we lead? At the head level, what do we believe about leadership? What is our thinking on leadership issues? And then, of course, the hands represents the behaviors. We're calling this the be, know, and do of leadership. The being part is the heart. The knowing about leadership. The vision, the goals, the strategies, the purpose. And then, of course, the final one, the doing, the leadership behaviors. The leadership behaviors. Now, let me ask you a question. If you only have present the head and the hands of leadership, the thinking and the doing, but you have no heart in your leadership. You haven't gotten the heart right. What kind of leadership do you have? You have an inauthentic leadership. And people can tell that you're not an authentic leader. You really don't care. You don't have the heart right. You can use serving leadership techniques, methodologies. You can manipulate people through serving leadership, but you're not authentic, and people will tell. What if you have only the heart and the hands? You've got the heart right. You have the behaviors, but you haven't really thought through. You don't have good leadership thinking. What kind of leadership do you have? Illogical. Illogical. You need to have leadership that has the heart, the hands, and the head working together. And then the final one, of course, is the heart and the head. If you have only those, what kind of leadership do you have? You have the thinking right, you have the heart right, but you don't have any good behaviors. You're simply an incompetent leader. You're an incompetent leader. We need to get all of them working together. I'd like to start us off on the heart of leadership with a quote from Robert S. McGee. He said that if Satan had a formula for success or for self-worth, it would look like this. My performance plus the opinion of others equals my self-worth. How many of us lead out of pleasing other people? We want people to see us as somebody great. Our self-worth is often based on what other people think about us or on our performance, what we have accomplished in life. This is how we kind of build our leadership credibility. Jesus comes into our world and says, no, it's not based on that. That's Satan's formula, says Robert S. McGee. When we come back from the break, we're going to look at the fact that many times when we make people our audience, we will tend to lead out of fear or pride. But if we make God our audience of one, that is when we can truly lead out of humility and God-grounded confidence. Welcome back. And I have to start out with a story on our second session here. When I directed a nonprofit in Thailand for 10 years, Global Tribes Outreach, a mission organization dedicated to impacting unreached people groups and underprivileged children, I remember about maybe 5-6 months into my new leadership role with this organization, I was having a group meeting with my first team. And we were sitting in this room, and I was talking to them, and what was interesting is that you could have cut the air in the room with a knife. It was so tense. You know why? Because I had a wonderful plan for their lives. Do you ever meet a leader that it's all about the leader, it's all about their plan, and they don't really listen to their followers or the ones that they're leading? I attended a Lead Like Jesus encounter in the next year or two. My leadership mentor invited me to come to an encounter that him and his wife were facilitating in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And a year later, after that encounter, one of the staff members came up to me and said, "Luke, your leadership has changed so much in the last year." He said, "You now listen to us." A serving leader listens to their people. That doesn't mean that they don't lead with vision, they don't have strategies and goals, but they listen to hear the real needs of those that they are leading. We now enter into the heart of leadership in your notes on the third page. And the question we're asking ourselves is, who are we leading to please? Now, we can listen to our people, we can lead to please them, or we can ultimately listen to our audience of one, God Almighty. We can get our operating mission and purpose from Him ultimately. And for me, I ask the question when I lay my head on the pillow at night, did I serve my audience of one ultimately? And if I do, then I will also lead to the best interests of the people who are under my leadership. I will have their best in mind. So here's the question. Who do I lead to please? Who do I lead to please? We either can lead from pride, which leads to self-promotion. Two things. We can either lead to pride, which leads to self-promotion, or we can lead out of fear, which means that we self-protect ourselves in leadership. If we're leading out of a prideful attitude, we build ourselves up, we inflate ourselves, and we self-exalt, we self-promote. But if we are leading out of fear, we're afraid of what people think of us, we will often protect ourselves. We'll erect barriers around ourselves in our leadership. And we truly are not leading from the right audience. We're leading to please people. We've met insecure leaders. We've met proud leaders. And they're not serving leaders. Now, Jim Collins gave us a great metaphor for the serving leader when he said that a good leader looks out the window when things are going really well on his team. And he says, it's because my team did it. Serving leadership is not about I, but it's about we. The power of we over the I. And the leader looks out the window, looks to his team and says, they did it. And I get to be a part of something great with them. The other picture that Jim Collins gave us on leadership is looking in the mirror. He said many times a self-serving leader will look in the mirror when things are going really well and say, oh, I did it. It's all about me. And that's a self-serving leader that leads from pride. And when things go really bad, they look out the window and they blame their team. Have you ever met a self-serving leader that when things go wrong, they don't take responsibility, but they blame the people they led? This has happened many times in leadership. But we lead when we look at our team, at the people that we are stewarding, the resources we have, and we see it as we rather than I. The second thing that happens in leadership when we lead to please our audience of one is that God gives us a confidence. We get to know who we are and whose we are. Remember the temptations? Satan came and he said, if you are the Son of God, then do this. Jesus knew who he was and he knew whose he was. When you and I are leaders leading at a higher level, leading for a greater purpose than ourselves, we know who we are, whose we are, what we are called to do, and therefore we have God-grounded confidence and courage to do the right thing. We have true business ethics. However, when we lead to please people, what happens? Well, look at your chart. Out of pride and fear, we have broken relationships. We compare ourselves among ourselves, which the Bible says is not wise. We have a very temporal focus. That is leading out of fear and pride. But the results of leading out of humility and courage, when God is our audience of one, that leads instead to community, to collaboration, contentment, fellowship, and eternal perspective. We have two very different roads depending on how we lead. I'd like us now to go to our groups, or with a learning partner beside us, and I'd like you to talk about that question. Do you struggle more with pride and self-promotion, or with fear, leading to self-protect, to please people? How does this affect you and the people with whom you have relationships if you lead out of pride and fear? I want you to talk to the person beside you right now about that. Do you lead out of pride or fear? Now, I'll just give you an example. This is something that you could share with the person seated beside you. A lot of times in my family, for example, I think my way is the best way. Have you ever heard that term, my way or the highway? My way or you take the highway? And sometimes my children will give ideas. And maybe it's something as simple as where are we going to go on vacation, or what are we going to do tomorrow? And I say, well, I think we ought to do this. And sometimes I will power over them and say, no, this is what we're going to do. I don't really listen to them. I lead out of pride. My way is the best way. Sometimes I will shut people down in relationship because of pride. Sometimes, as a public speaker, I will only speak certain things because I don't want to offend my audience. Does that ever happen in leadership? I'm leading out of fear. Leading out of fear. I'd like to close out our section, this section here, on some disciplines of a serving leader. What are some disciplines that you and I can practice in our daily lives that can help us overcome fear and pride and stay aligned on a heart level? All right? And so the first one is prayer. Prayer is where you and I get aligned with our Father. In Mark chapter 1, Jesus, remember I told you in the first session, had started healing. They brought people to him late at night after he healed Peter's mother-in-law. And early the next morning he went out and had a time of solitude where he met with his Father. And I would look at that as a time of alignment. Not that Jesus was out of alignment, but he got alone with his audience of one to listen. And out of that time, his disciples came and said, Jesus, we started this massive healing campaign. Get back to the waiting room. It's filled with people. And Jesus said, no, we must go elsewhere, for that is why I have come. Prayer realigns us with our Father's will. And by the way, prayer is not just about talking to God. It's also listening to him. It's a two-way conversation. The other discipline is very connected with prayer. And I think for leaders, this is a really tough one. To actually set aside times of solitude where we can listen. Listen to our own heart. Listen to the Father speak to us. It's very difficult for the busy leader because we are so busy doing that we forget to first be. And isn't it interesting that God created human beings, not human doings? We need to take time for solitude. Block it out in your calendar to listen, to get aligned, to hear your own heart on pride, fear, humility, confidence. And then finally, unconditional love. Unconditional love. You and I need to experience the unconditional love of God. We need to know whose we are and who we are in him. Margie Blanchard, Ken's wife, said that the antidote to fear and pride is the unconditional love of God. When you and I know that we are ultimately loved by the one that really matters, that gives us confidence and courage to do the right thing. And we don't have to worry about all the voices of those in the world who are crying for our attention, who are putting all these demands on us. We ultimately serve our audience of one. And when you and I can experience his unconditional love, as we're going to see later in this material, we can then also express unconditional love. But we first have to experience it to deal with our fear and pride. Who are we truly pleasing? If we know we're unconditionally loved, that is the antidote to fear and pride. We now turn to the head part of leadership, which is what do we believe? What do we think when we think about leadership? What are our beliefs? Here we get into purpose and mission statements. We're going to be talking about this. But first, we want to look at a leadership philosophy. What is the difference between God's perspective of leadership and the world's perspective on leadership? The knowing part of leadership is where we're at. First we looked at the being, now we look at the knowing part of leadership. Well, the first thing is that we are looking at a serving leadership role model, Jesus Christ. He served. God's view on leadership is that we are here to serve. Even in a prophecy about Jesus in the book of Isaiah, this is my servant. And Jesus served the best interests of the people of the world. By becoming like one of us, the incarnation, he served our best interests. You and I have a serving leadership point of view when we seek the best interests of the people we lead. Now that doesn't mean that we do what they want. We do what is best for them. We stay aligned with our mission and our purpose, what is right for them. And that doesn't always mean pleasing the people that we lead. All right, I want to be very clear on that. We're not talking about the inmates running the prison. The world's perspective on leadership, it's all about authority and power. The charismatic leader, the big man, the great man. We see this sometimes even in ministry, when ministries are named after leaders. That always makes me a little bit uncomfortable when I see a Christian ministry named after a person. All right? Now I realize, people, we are named after Christ. And Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. There's nothing wrong with good role models. But when leadership is primarily about a person and not about the mission and purpose that person is about. And really we see this in terms of the world's view on authority and power. Authority is derived by my title, my position, or the amount of money that I have. And I use my power, I use my authority for whatever purposes that suit me. In serving leadership, however, it's different. Serving leadership says it's more about the power of love rather than loving power. Let me say that again. It's more about the power of love. As a leader, Tim Sanders, who worked with, I think he was a CFO or some high-level leadership role with Yahoo. He wrote a book called Love is a Killer App. And you would think that, and it was a business book, you would think that we wouldn't combine love with business leadership, but Tim says no. Tim Sanders, in his book Love is a Killer App, that love is a powerful motivator for a leader. When we truly love and care for our people and don't just rely on power. So it's not about loving power, but it's about the power of love in our relationships. Moving on, the second perspective when it comes to God's view on leadership, a leadership philosophy is that people are to be loved. People are made in the image of God. Young, old, different race, different backgrounds. Everyone is valuable, whether they are in the low end of the economic scale or on the high end. Everyone is beloved and appreciated and valued. We are made in the image of God. I know in many times in my leadership, I didn't have time for children. Children were beneath me. Children needed to grow up so I could have an articulate conversation with them as an adult. But what did Jesus do? He took them on his knee. He blessed the children. He said, this is how the kingdom comes, when you are like a little child. So my leadership has changed. And I know I'm a very short person, but when I meet a child, I'll get down on one knee. And if they'll let me, I'll even hug them and show them love. But I like to get down on their level and look them in the eye. Leading children, leading everyone on their level. You and I as leaders, like Jesus, need to incarnate, come down to their level, come down where they're at. Listen to their story on their terms. That's a servant leader. People are to be loved. But in the world's perspective, people are to be controlled, to be used. It's more about the economics. I'm going to use my people to make money, and love, I'm going to let that one tip up on the scale. That's not as heavy for me. It's more about using people to get what I want. I'm going to control them in my business and my organization to help pad the bottom line, the economic sphere of leadership. That's the world's perspective. When it comes to work, Christians believe that work is worship. In fact, at Trinity Methodist tomorrow morning, I'm going to be sharing a message on work as worship. Because our work is an act of worship. Everything we do is an act of worship. So many people look at work as a curse. They don't like to go to work on Mondays, or they say, thank God it's Friday. but not so for us. Our work is an act of worship. Work is a good thing, and we use it to glorify God. We build excellent products because we are serving not our customers primarily, but we're serving God. So we do everything with excellence. We provide customer care because we value people. We work as worship, whereas in the world's perspective, we're not looking how we can use our work to glorify God, but rather we are looking at our work as something that is mostly time-driven. We always look forward to the weekend. We can't wait to get out of the office. And we see work only as glorifying man and earning a living. All our work is about is collecting the paycheck so we can have a better lifestyle, and also we love to work so it makes us look good. We like to rise through the echelons of leadership to become the great man. And leadership is about glorifying man and earning a living. But for the Christian, it's different. It's about primarily glorifying God, serving Him with excellence, everything that our hand finds to do. Now this leads us to a discussion on purpose and mission. What do people think and believe when it comes to leadership? So let's talk a little bit about vision. I don't know how many of you have actually worked on a mission statement or a purpose statement. And sometimes this is a convoluted discussion because we can go in so many different realms when it comes to talking about goals and strategies and mission and purpose and long-term vision and what have you. And some of us are a little bit turned off by it as well because there's this mission statement at our office that hangs on the wall that nobody cares about. We did all the hard work, we put this fancy statement up there, but nobody really lives by it. I'm not suggesting that kind of a mission statement. I'm talking about a personal mission statement for you and I that gets serious about who we are, whose we are, and what is God calling us to do with the rest of our lives. I believe it was Benjamin Franklin, an early president of the United States, that said, "Many will die at age 20 and be buried at 75. Let me say that again. Many will die at age 20 and be buried at 75. What was he talking about? Many people, when they're young, they have visions, they have dreams, they want to accomplish great things. But then they settle down, get a job, make a normal living, just be normal, just keep the status quo, and never really amount to much. I think God created us for much more than that. I believe that our mission and our purpose is just as important as Queen Esther. "You have come to the kingdom for such a time as this," said her uncle Mordecai. You and I have a purpose and a mission. Do we know what it is? Have we written it down? Have we really found out from God what our purpose is in life? And it can involve work. It can involve family. It can involve all the normal things that every one of us is involved in. But do we know what it is? Have we articulated it? So I want to break our vision down into really 4 different parts. Our overriding purpose, our values, our guiding principles, our picture of the future, our dreams, and then our goals and strategies to get there. Let me talk about these very, very briefly. The first one is purpose. And I believe this is where the circles of our passion, proficiency, and profitability all intersect in the middle to form our sweet spot. This could be our calling or our vocation. Now, when you look at my story, I grew up in Southern Ontario, Canada. My father was a farmer. He had a construction business. I thought I was going to grow up to take over his business and to also take over the family farm. But instead, at age 19, I moved out to Western Canada. I became a teacher in a small parochial school. Now, I've been very passionate about a number of things in life. I'm a Canadian, so I played a lot of hockey. I was fast. I wasn't big. I couldn't hit people. You all know what hockey is, right? Ice hockey. You go to a fight and a game breaks out every once in a while. Okay, that's Canadian hockey, unfortunately. But we did win the World Cup last week. Did you all see that? Okay, so the Canadians did a pretty good job in hockey. But I was small, and so I kind of relied on my speed. I was passionate about hockey as a young man. I was a stamp collector. I loved to do stamp collecting. I was passionate about collecting stamps. But when I moved out to Western Canada, became a school teacher, I realized that I had also a passion to communicate, to teach, to influence younger people. And I learned that I had another passion. Let's go to the second circle, proficiency. I've been proficient in many different areas. This is what we call our strengths. And this isn't about being boastful or arrogant, but many of us can name different strengths that we have. I can work really hard with my hands. I love to work. I have a strong work ethic. I could say that's a strength. I found out about myself when I got older that I was pretty good with spreadsheets. I worked in Microsoft Excel, and I could manipulate, I could set up formulas, I could manipulate spreadsheets fairly well. I was pretty good at that. There were a number of other things. I wasn't too bad at hockey, and there were many things that fell into my proficiency range. But I discovered when I began to teach and communicate that I could actually become a better communicator. That was another part of my strength that I didn't even realize until I began to teach school and began to speak to audiences. So that was part of my proficiency. There's a third area, and that's profitability. We all have to make a living somehow. We all have to put bread and water on the table. And there's a lot of things that I can do to be profitable. I could have taken my father's business. I could have ran with the family farm. I could have maybe sold my stamp collection and been profitable that way. There were many things I could have done to be profitable in life. But I discovered that my speaking, my teaching, my leadership development is where my profitability intersects with my gifting, with my passion. And while I cannot stay in my sweet spot all of the time, I want to share with you that when I operate in my sweet spot, where my passion, proficiency, and profitability all intersect, that is where I have the greatest joy. Are you with me? That's where I experience the greatest joy, and it's also where I bring God the greatest glory. When I can find that spot. Now here's the statistics, folks, that you need to hear. Around the world today, about 87% of our globe are not happy with the job that they're in. They're not satisfied with their work. They're simply working a job because it pays the bills, or maybe their mother or father thought they should go and get a degree in engineering, or whatever it is. But they're truly not working in work where they really love to be working. Some places it's 50%, some places it's 60%, 70%. But I believe globally that people are not satisfied with, and I think that's a tragedy. It's a tragedy when you and I don't know what our numbers are, and we can't live in that sweet spot most of the time. That's a tragedy. And by the way, I don't just live in my sweet spot, I'm also very proficient at washing the dishes. Anybody with me here on this one? I know some of you are thinking, just put it in the dishwasher. Okay, we could do that. But at my house, one of the ways that I serve my wife is by washing the dishes for every supper. All right? And I'm pretty proficient at washing dishes. I'm not very passionate about it, but I do operate outside of my sweet spot part of the time. Okay? And so there are some things that you need to do, right? You need to do as part of your commitment to whatever relationship you're in or whatever business you're in. You can't be operating your sweet spot all of the time. But the point is to move toward your purpose, discover what your passion, proficiency, and profitability is, where those intersect. And you will receive the greatest joy and give God the greatest glory when you operate in that part. Let's move to the second part, your values, guiding principles. By the way, Jesus had a purpose. He said to the disciples when he called them, you know how to fish for fish. I'm going to teach you how to fish for people, men. And in the very end of the book of Matthew, he said, you're going to go out and make disciples of all the nations in the world. Jesus had a big picture. He had a purpose and a mission for his disciples. So values and guiding principles are those things that really make me tick, those things that are really important to me. Okay, at the top of my values list is this idea of God-centeredness. That's my number one value. It might be different for you, and that's okay. For me, I want to do everything that glorifies God. The second value for me is love. I want to be known as somebody who loves everybody, regardless of their background, regardless of their orientation, regardless of their language, regardless of who they are, young, old, small. I want to be known as one who loves. I may not agree with them, but I want to at least be known for the value of loving them. Are you with me? That's a second value for me. It comes under God-centeredness. Why is that? Because when Jesus shared his two values, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he rank ordered them. You see, if we love people, but we don't love God first, we really don't end up loving people. We don't really help them out of their brokenness. And so it has to be rank ordered. Your values have to be rank ordered. My third value is leadership. My fourth one is simplicity. My fourth one is simplicity. Simplicity is very important to me. I like simple, efficient systems. I love to live a simple life. I don't like to have it convoluted with all kinds of complexity. I like simplicity on the far side of complexity. There is complexity, but I like simplicity. but it's number 4. Why? Well, let me tell you. I've been married for 21 years. We celebrated our anniversary yesterday. And when I normally celebrate an anniversary, I go and I buy my wife some long-stemmed roses. She loves roses. Do they do that here in Singapore? Women love roses? Okay. So I get her the roses. Now, I could do that every year. You know, a value for me is simplicity. It's a lot cheaper just to do roses, right? But when we got to our 10th anniversary, we were living in Chiang Mai, Thailand. I flew her down to Bangkok, and we stayed in a nice hotel, and she went out and she shopped. Now, I don't like to shop. She loves to shop till she drops. All right? But for me, simplicity had to come under the value of love on our 10th anniversary. 15th anniversary, same thing. I flew her out to California. We stayed on a nice resort, took her down to the beach. She loved that because love trumps simplicity. Last year was our 20th anniversary. We went to Florida, stayed in a friend's condo. We made a bigger deal out of our anniversary than we normally do on years that are not on 5s. Okay, that's kind of where I've come down on anniversary trips. Now this year, she came with me to Singapore. Isn't that cool? What a great place to celebrate our anniversary. And but I want to point out that our values are very important, and typically where we struggle, folks, with conflict. And I think it was Ken Blanchard who said that life is all about the conflict of our values. A lot of times we think that people are against us. They're really not. They just simply rank order their values differently than we do. So when you're having conflict, instead of saying, that person doesn't like me, ask instead the question, how are they rank ordering their values? Because maybe it's only a conflict of values. And then you can bring the discussion down to discussing your values. So know what your values are. And by the way, I'm giving you a very rapid course through this morning. When I do this in corporations and companies, we spend more time helping them think through their mission statement. And if you're interested, you can pick up my business card, go to my website, lukepford.com, and there's a resource there on purpose statement, how to write up a purpose statement. I have a 10-page template, and I do provide coaching around that as well. So there's a lot we could say about values, but make sure they're rank ordered. The third thing here is a picture of the future. What is your picture of the future? One of the things on my template is a trajectory that goes to the end of your life. And then you begin to say, where do I want to end up when I'm 70, 80, 90 years of age? Where do I want to be when I'm at that stage? And then to work yourself slowly back. If I want to be here, what do I have to do here to get here? Well, if I want to be here when I'm 70, what do I have to be doing at age 60? What do I have to be doing at 55? You start with the end in mind. Right? If you don't aim for anything, you hit nothing, right? You have to have the end, the big picture. And Jesus gives this to us in the Great Commission when he says, disciples of all nations. He's giving them a picture of the future. You and I have to have a big picture of our future. What does that look like? How will you get there? And then the goals and the strategies, of course, are the work that we fill out in order to get to where we want to go, right? We set goals. We strategize. And in my mission statement, sometimes those change. My values do not change. My picture of the future does not change, right? But my goals and strategies, those are more on a regular basis that we set those to get to where we believe we need to go. So what is your vision? What is your vision? And I believe it should include all of these different things. So let's look at some disciplines yet on the area of knowing. The first one here is the idea of solitude and prayer. At the bottom of your sheet there, you see prayer, supportive relationships, resources, and scripture. We all need to get alone to know who we are and let the audience of one speak to us. Another part of this area of knowing is having supportive relationships, people that can speak into our lives. Ken Blanchard once said that feedback is the breakfast of champions. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Wheaties here in Singapore or not. Do they have a cereal named Wheaties here? In North America, we say that Wheaties is the breakfast of champions. But feedback is the breakfast of champions. When you and I are willing to receive feedback, when we allow people to speak into our lives, that can help us move toward becoming a champion. A serving leader gets feedback. They're also willing to give feedback to help develop people. So supportive relationships, we don't know if we don't ask. How many of you have heard of the Johari window? Okay, a few of you have. You might want to Google that and discover this idea that the more we disclose to others, the more we begin to learn about ourselves. When we get feedback, when we're honest with other people, it actually helps us become the people that we were meant to be. The Johari window, Johari. Johari. It's a great concept on self-knowledge. And supportive relationships can help with that. Feedback is the breakfast of champions. And then finally, what are we reading? What conferences are we attending? Do we take time in the Word of God to get our directions? Something that we do in our family on a regular basis is we read a proverb or a chapter of Proverbs. That's kind of our daily thing that we do before our son heads out the door to go to school. And we like to read through the Proverbs. There's so much wisdom in there. And then we typically go around the table and we say, which proverb from that chapter stood out to you today and why? And how will you apply that in your life today? So we need to have resources. We need to have conferences and books and things to help develop us as people. We now turn to the hands of leadership, the doing part, the behaviors, serving leadership behaviors. Some of you are probably wondering about the switch that I make between servant leadership and serving leadership. Why do you think we use the word serving rather than servant often? Because it's not just about who we are, but it's about what we do. It's about our behaviors. We are doers. Doers of the word, James says. We need to be serving. Not just be servants, but be servers, serving others. And this is where we talk about the doing part of leadership. I'd like you to look in your notes right now. The key question here is on page 5, what do serving leaders do? What do they do? Robert Greenleaf, the man behind, really the originator of this idea of servant leadership in our more modern day, in the last 100 years, we've had kind of a resurgence of servant leadership. Even in the last 5-10 years, it's becoming a more popular word in the business world. But Robert Greenleaf, he gives a test on whether or not you're a serving leader, a servant leader. And he says this: do those served grow as persons? Those that are under you that you are serving, are they growing as people? Are they becoming better people as a result of your leadership? Do they become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to be servants? Let me say that again. Do they become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to be servants? Another part of his test, in terms of are we actually serving others, he says, what is the effect of your leadership on the least privileged of society? Is your leadership influencing those who are among the least privileged? Or will they benefit, or at least will they not be further deprived? If our leadership is helping those on the margins of society, we are truly serving leaders. I think Robert Greenleaf was also a follower of Jesus and speaking from that paradigm of truly affecting change among the least privileged. And that brings us to our discussion on change. Change. Time for change. Time for change. We need to talk a little bit about change because leadership is all about introducing change. It's helping people become the people they were meant to be. It starts with you and I change. Leadership is all about implementing change. And it really happens at 4 different levels. In your notes, you're going to notice there 4 different words. The first one is knowledge. And knowledge is fairly easy to change. You can just give somebody some new information. You can change people at a knowledge level by introducing them to some new concepts that they've never thought of before. Send them to the library. They can change on the level of knowledge, but it gets a little bit more difficult when you come to attitude. Attitude. People might say, yeah, I intellectually know that I ought to change, but I don't feel like it, right? And some of you have children who may say, I'm seated because you told me to sit down, but in my heart I'm standing up. Does that ever happen in our parenting? Attitude is a little harder to change, isn't it? And then the third level of change is behavior. When I moved back from Asia in a little town in Indiana, our neighbor was trying to stop smoking. He knew intellectually that smoking was harmful to his health. He wanted to stop because it was harmful to his lungs. And secondly, he had the attitude to change. He knew that he wanted to change, he wanted to stop smoking. If he got to 2 weeks without having a smoke, we would celebrate, say, yeah, Greg, way to go. And he had the attitude, but the behavior was a little bit harder for him. He would have relapses and fall back. Now let's just stay on this idea of smoking. The hardest place to bring about change, folks, you start with knowledge, you move to attitude, and you can even get behavior to change in individuals. But it's getting the entire organization aligned. Everybody on the same page, changing the entire culture of an organization. That's where change is truly difficult. Working one-on-one, working with a team, but getting the entire organization or the entire society to stop smoking, in this case, is much more difficult. And yet that's exactly what Jesus did when he came to our world. He worked on knowledge. You get the Sermon on the Mount, right? That's the first thing that Jesus does in Matthew. He gives them new information. You have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. And he takes them to a new level of knowledge. The second thing that Jesus had to work on was their attitude. The disciples, for example, the Jews, hated the Samaritans. At one point, they said to Jesus, because this village of Samaritans didn't give them bread, right? And they said, can we just call down fire from heaven and zap them? You know, I've run into that attitude in our world. I've run it in myself. I know in North America one time I was traveling, I was speaking to a group of people out in the West. And the man that picked me up at the airport, it was back around 9/11, the catastrophe that happened in New York. And we were talking about some of the problems in our world. And he referred to the Muslim problem, and his attitude was, we ought to just nuke them. That's a tragedy. When anyone has an attitude toward any group of people. And I've had to repent of my attitudes. You know, in fact, I've met a lot of Muslim people who put Christians to shame. That's been my experience. And I think a lot of Christians ought to learn how to love, be gentle and kind from Muslims. And I think this is true of any group of people. We have something to learn from everybody, and never should we have an attitude like the disciples, let's just call down fire from heaven and zap them. But this happens. We see this in the racism that is rampant in North America today. People have an attitude much like the disciples. Let's just call down fire from heaven and zap those Samaritans. The attitude level that Jesus had to work on. And even when you get to the end of his ministry in Acts chapter 1, when he's getting ready to go back to the Father, what do the disciples say? Are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel? They're still ethnocentristic. They're still looking at building their own kingdom. It is hard to change people's attitudes. It's hard to change our attitudes sometimes. The third level, of course, with Jesus is the idea of changing people, not just at the knowledge and the attitude level, but their behaviors. And we see this with Peter. Peter is this impetuous young disciple that wants to follow Jesus, and he gets out of the boat, right? He's the only guy besides Jesus who has walking on water on his resume, right? Peter is this guy that is just go get 'em and passionate, but his behaviors need some changing as well. Remember at the crucifixion, it's Peter who denies Jesus. It's Peter who whips out the sword and whacks off somebody's ear. Peter has the attitude right. He wants to follow Jesus. He has the knowledge right, but his behaviors need some adjustment, need some changing. And then, of course, the fourth level is organizational change. And this is where Jesus sent out these disciples to turn the world upside down. What I find fascinating about the model of Jesus is that, in fact, they did exactly that. We see these incompetent disciples that Jesus developed at a higher level, so much so that when we get to the book of Acts, the rulers of that time who captured them, brought them before their ruling elders, said, these unlearned and ignorant men have been with Jesus. And they went out boldly, proclaiming, even when they were told, you must not say anything more. They said, You're not our audience. We have an audience of one, and we ought to obey God rather than man. They're courageous. They're bold. They go out. They break out of prisons, and we see tremendous things happening as these incompetent disciples go out and lay down their lives. In fact, 10 out of the 11 disciples, because Judas committed suicide, 10 out of the 11 actually laid down their lives. According to the Christian tradition, they actually became martyrs for the cause of Christ. So we see the entire organization getting on board. Jesus was all about change at different levels. Change. Now, usually when I have a lot more time for this experience, I will do an exercise, and I will get everybody standing up, standing back to back, and they make changes in their appearance. They turn around, identify those changes, then I will have them make some more changes, and you learn very quickly that it's hard to make simple changes even in your appearance. But we're not going to take time for that here today. It's a lot of fun, a lot of laughter, and people get some very interesting styles. So what I want you to do instead is to take your hands and to clasp them together like this. All right? Clasp them together like this. Now, there's been some recent studies done that we typically tend to clasp our hands only one way. We prefer a certain way of clasping our hands. But it's actually healthier for us if we learn to unclasp and clasp one finger over. That if we only do it this way, it's actually not healthy for our circulation, but we have to learn to clasp it this way as well. So from now on, I want you to not clasp your hands the preferred way, but to clasp them the other way. Some of you are going, Luke, I want to know about this study. Is it really out of Harvard? No. I made that all up. There is no study about this being better for circulation. Okay, that's bogus. All right, you don't have to worry about this at all. Now, let me ask you this question. Is there a better way to clasp your hands? Is there a way that's stronger, better? Or is it simply a preferred opinion of yours that this is the way to do it? Neither one, right? It's just a preference. And sometimes change is really that simple. It's a preference. Now, we can have all kinds of arguments and reasons, and we can say this is why this is a better way, but we really don't learn to listen when we have a preferred way, and we argue for our preference rather than for what is right. And so when we look at this area of change, we first have to realize that change is difficult, obviously, many times because this is just our preferred way of doing it. This is a way we're used to doing it. Leadership is all about coming in and changing what's difficult so that something becomes better. And sometimes we have to let go of the old in order to embrace the new. And Jesus uses this wonderful metaphor of putting new wine into old wineskins. What happens to the wineskins? They break. You need to have new wineskins for new wine. It's all about change, folks. Leadership is about change. People resist it for a number of reasons. First of all, people resist change because of fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown. They don't know what's coming. And so as leaders, we have to prepare them for what is coming. As leaders, we have to be futurists. We have to see the big picture and prepare people for what is coming. Fear of the unknown. The next one is fear of loss. People fear losing. And they want to know what they're going to gain when they give up their loss. Is the gain greater than the loss? And so as leaders, we first have to sell them on why the loss is less than the gain that they're going to get once they give up the loss. All right? As leaders, to help people embrace change, we have to sell the loss as less than what is gained. Thirdly, people fear failure. They don't want to go out in the field and play because they're afraid they're going to drop the ball. Or in our part of the country here, it's not football as we know it in North America, but it's actually soccer as we know it. You call it football, and I think you get it right. I think that our version of football, by the way, is really not football. We're throwing the ball, and you truly are football, right? And by the way, my kids all played real football, soccer. They all grew up playing soccer, and we love the game of football, according to the Singaporean concept, and actually the whole world. Americans just have to get with it. Okay, so fear of failure. And then finally, people do not change. They resist change because of personal preferences. They actually have a preferred way of doing it. Let's switch gears now and talk a little bit about leadership development. How do we actually develop people? I want to introduce you to a model of leadership development that I believe Jesus used with his disciples. And, many times when we try to develop people, bring people from one thing to another thing, we try to introduce change, we find that it's very difficult simply because our model of development is not very well thought through. For example, when I led a nonprofit up in Thailand, I would explain, I would talk about our strategies, methods, I would teach, I would instruct, and then I prided myself in being an empowering leader, a delegating leader. And then I would say to our people, go get them. And I support you. Now go get them. And they would go out there and they would make mistakes. And I would look at them and say, but I told you how to do it. I showed you. Why aren't you doing it? Why are you making mistakes? And really it came back to a bad leadership developmental model. So what we want to look at here very quickly is that when we model after the model of Jesus, he was a carpenter, and some would say that carpentry also included stonemasonry. In North America, we have this thing called the trades, and when you are developed according to the trades, you first start out as a novice. Okay, we're using the word here beginner or beginning. Everybody starts out at a stage where they're just learning to do something. In the trades, we call it a novice. If you become a carpenter, if you become an electrician, you start out as a novice. And then you move to the stage called apprentice. Apprentice. You begin to apprentice under a master electrician or master builder. And I'm not sure what term you would have for that here in Singapore, but we're going to use the word growing. A person moves to a growing stage. Now they become dangerous enough to make mistakes, right? And then after they begin to grow for a while, they become mature. And in our trades, we call that a journeyman. They now move to the journeyman stage. And then finally, after they've matured and had lots of experience, they can become a master. And we're calling that the reproducing stage. All right? So let's take a look at a young person learning to work on a computer. They start out and they say, teacher, I just need to know how to turn this thing on. Right? Where's the power button? Where's the power button? And that's where we all start. And at this stage of a beginner, we don't have to give them lots of support and encouragement and say, go get them, I believe in you, you can run a computer, you can figure it out, I believe in you. No, we simply show them how to push on the power button. And at this stage of leadership development, people do not need all kinds of support, they need direction. The social sciences, by the way, if you're interested in Googling this and looking this up, it's called the Situational Leadership 2 model that Ken Blanchard and Hersey came out with. Situational Leadership 2. You can see this very same model. At the beginning stage, someone just starting out needs the basic information of what, how, where, when, and why. At the next stage, when somebody is being developed, they need to have some experience with you leaning over their shoulder and showing them, helping them. They need lots of time with you because now they're dangerous enough to delete files, right? When it comes to working on the computer. And so what do they need from you at this stage? One who is in training needs further instruction, practice, and evaluation. Your leadership changes. And then third stage of leadership development, this is where a person is beginning to mature. They need assignments. Now they need greater support. They don't need as much direction, but they need more opportunities to hone their skills. And they need to be able to work alone on assignments that you give them. They're at the maturing stage. And then finally, you get to the stage of reproducing. What these people need from you is opportunities to teach others. One of the best ways to learn is to become a teacher. And when somebody becomes a master, we so often in leadership, we clip their wings by continuing to micromanage them. When really we should let them set them free. Give them autonomy to make decisions on their own. They're now masters, have been well developed. So let's take a look at this model just one more time and ask the question, what type of leadership style do you use at each one of those levels? Well, first of all, think about a coach with a team of young players. You know, when my kids played on soccer clubs, football clubs back in North America, I would go to the game to watch them play. Not the coach. At the moment where the team is losing really bad, the coach runs out on the field and starts scoring goals. I would have not been happy with that kind of a coach, right? I showed up to watch my kid play. Okay? Now the coach might be able to do it well, do it better, but a coach uses a different style of leadership. When he's at practices, he's showing them how to kick the ball. You don't kick with your toe, you kick with the side of your foot. He's showing them. But during the game, he's on the sidelines. He's cheering them on. Maybe he'll pull a player out and he'll give them some advice. He's using different styles of leadership to develop his players. So in the same way, when you and I develop other people, when we're starting out in the beginning stage, they, as a person being developed under our leadership, they need us to be an instructor. They need lots of information from us. They need a teacher to teach them. When they are at the growing stage, this is a very critical stage for them, they need us to be a coach, one who shows them. And I like this image here of a coach showing the little boy how to hold the bat, how to put his feet apart. They need us to be very much involved at the growing stage, because this is where failure happens. Not micromanagement, but being present, asking them, what do you need from me? And then thirdly, at this stage, they don't need a micromanager. They need somebody who's more like a mentor. Somebody who asks them questions from time to time, good questions, who gives them assignments, who has them check in every once in a while. You move to the level of leadership development known as a mentor. And then finally, once they get to the place where they can reproduce themselves and teach others, you simply get out of the way. You give them the power and the authority to make those decisions, to do what they need to do to get the job done. And you simply stand out of the way, and you become a cheerleader. You commission them. You believe in them. You give them opportunities to run with the vision. So there's the 4 stages of leadership development that we believe Jesus used with his disciples. He called them, he modeled to them, he taught them, then he modeled to them, then he gave them opportunities to go out. They came back, they said, well, wow, even the demons are trembling at your name. And he says, coaching, mentoring, he says, rejoice not in that, but rather that your names are written in the book. And Jesus is coaching and mentoring them along the way, and then finally he says, greater works you will do when I go back to the Father. If Jesus had stuck around for a lot longer, Peter and John would not have gone out with boldness and done what they did. Jesus had to leave so that they could move on in their leadership. So this is the model of leadership that we have. Father, thank you that you have called us for such a time as this to lead, love, and serve like Jesus. I ask that you would give us wisdom from above to be servant leaders in the marketplace. You who began a good work in us, would you perform and complete it in the day of Christ Jesus? And all of God's people said, amen.